Johnny Prime here. Today we're going to cook a boneless New York strip steak. The first thing you want to do is, if your steak is frozen, let it thaw out. I like to take it out of the freezer and put it in the refrigerator overnight so it thaws slowly. If your steak is already thawed, then you should take it out of the fridge and let it get to room temperature before cooking it. This will allow for a quicker sear on the outside, and the center will come up to temperature faster. So while we wait for that, let's talk about how we're going to cook it. For boneless steaks, I generally go with traditional searing on the stove top. If it's thick, if your steak is thick, like this one here, it's like 1.5 inches thick, there is a second step inside the oven, but we'll get to that later. So the goal of searing is to create a nice brown crust on the exterior. This is called the Maillard reaction. The browning of proteins creates texture and it concentrates flavor. So how do we do this? First, let's talk about pans. Most of you have a cast iron or a stainless steel pan at home. A cast iron pan is tried and true for developing a sear. It's hard, iron, heavy, it gets really hot, and it creates a great crust. Most times people who use cast iron are not manipulating the pan because they're so heavy and because the handle gets super hot. So unless you have gloves or something to wrap around this, and if your wrists are really strong and you can hold the pan for long and manipulate it, then you can do that. But most people are just going to keep it stationary. They put the steak in, they sear it, they take the steak out, and that's it. And cleanup is super easy. You just use hot water, you rinse it out, you scrape off any cruds that may have formed with chainmail, and then you wipe it out and dry it and put a little slick of oil on it to keep it from rusting and to preserve the season that you've developed on it. Stainless steel pans are for people who cook with lots of movement and manipulation. These are lighter, you can grab the handle without burning yourself. And if you've heard people talk about butter basting a steak, they're most likely doing it in a stainless steel pan. They tip the pan and baste the steak with butter as it cooks. But of course I have a third option for you. This is carbon steel. It's kind of like a hybrid between cast iron and stainless. You get all the great searing ability of cast iron with this great cooking surface, but you have all the manipulation ability of stainless because you can grab the handle. It's not nearly as heavy as cast iron. So that's what I'm going to be using today. First, pat your steak dry. You never want excessive amounts of fluid on the steak when you cook it in the pan. Otherwise, you'll create steam, and the steam will destroy any chance of getting that nice brown Maillard crust. For a strip steak like this, there's often a thick ridge of fat on one side, as you can see here. I always like to score that with a knife. Scoring the fat does two things. Number one, it helps the fat render out while it cooks, and that will add flavor, and it'll help you get a better crust as it cooks. And the second thing is that it prevents the steak from curling in the pan. You want the steak to remain in contact with the pan at all times while it's cooking, at all parts of the steak. If one side is curled up, you will get steam on that side, or you won't get the brown crust on it. So you want to keep the steak flat on the pan at all times. That way you get an even sear. Season it simply with salt. Other powders or spices or pepper can burn in the pan while it cooks, and that will create bitterness. I always like to add pepper afterwards, like just before eating. So now you'll want to get your pan nice and hot. I use just a little bit of high smoke point oil, like maybe a teaspoon of canola oil or peanut oil. Just a little bit, just so that the steak has a little slickness when it hits the pan. I like to constantly move the steak with tongs as it cooks. That way all surfaces make contact with the pan over and over, and rather than burning or charring, the steak will evenly turn golden and brown. I usually develop a good crust after just a few minutes in the pan on each side. If you're going to baste your steak with butter, you'll want to add butter in just before you flip to the other side. As the second side cooks, you'll tip the pan and spoon butter over the top side while developing the sear on the bottom. I won't be basting the steak in butter today while it cooks. Since I'm trying a new all-natural source of beef, I want to really just taste the flavor of the meat and nothing else. Once seared, I take the steak off the heat and put it on a cooling rack to rest for a bit. This is where I'll be checking to see what the temperature is. If it's at 125, I'll stop. If it's less, then I'll put it in the oven to roast it up to temperature for the finish. Use a meat thermometer to check the temperature. I set the oven on a super low temperature, like 170, and I roast the steak anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Again, you'll want to cook to temperature and not time. The ideal temperature for me is 125, and I'll usually pull the steak out of the oven at 120, since steaks usually like to climb a few degrees while they rest. If you're like me and you hate constantly opening the oven door to check the temperature, you can use a meat probe. I like this one called the meter. It sends the temperature right to an app on my phone and lets me know when it's done. Always rest your steak before slicing it. This will prevent any bleed out of those really tasty pink myoglobin juices that are inside. Presentation is just as important as cooking. We eat with our eyes first, so if we see something that's visually appealing, we will become more hungry for that item. So use a nice plate. Slice up your steak if you're serving someone and sharing. If you're eating by yourself, then use a paper plate, plastic fork and knife. You can do whatever you need to do. But if you're serving someone else, or if you're serving guests at a party, make it look nice. Take the extra minute or so to put it on a nice plate, or slice it up, or add some finishing salt, and that's about it. So now I'm going to cook it and do everything I just told you. Watch carefully, make sure I don't screw anything up. You don't want to get the pan too hot. Just as it starts to smoke a little bit, that's when you want to drop your steak in. As you can see, the smoke starting to come up. Again, constant movement. Make sure all surfaces of the steak are making contact with the pan at all times. You can see our scoring helped us a lot. It's not curling at all. Just reinforcing that everything is touching over and over and over on this. We're at just about 3 minutes, so I'm going to give it the flip. Look at that perfectly brown, perfect crust, even sear end to end. Same thing on this side. Constant movement. Make sure everything is touching at all times. This is the point where you would tip the pan and baste it with butter, but since I am not using butter, I will just use the steak's natural fats to baste. The reason I'm not using butter is because I'm trying a new source, an all-natural prime steak. And I'd like to taste just the meat itself. I didn't want any other spices on it, no other seasoning, no butter. Just the steak, the meat, salt, and its own fat. Also have to hit the sides a little bit. Get a little color on the sides. Get the fat side as well. Looking good, and it sure as hell smells good. So we were at about 3 minutes aside, just under. Now I'm going to take this off the heat and rest it. So at this point, while it's resting, we want to check the temperature and see how much more we have to go. This tiny meat thermometer is telling me I'm at around 110. As you can see, it's slowly climbing. I'll probably have about 12 more degrees to go cooking it in the oven. The one thing I also like to do is clean as I'm cooking. So while I'm waiting for the steak to rest a bit and check the temperature, I'm going to just start cleaning my pans, clean up the spoon, all the other things that I used in prep. Is just hot water, rinse it out. If there's anything stuck to it, use some chainmail to scrub it off. Otherwise, you just want to rinse it, wipe it, rinse it, wipe it. Do that over and over until you know your paper towel is pretty much coming off clean. And then just wipe a little bit of canola oil onto the pan. That way you kind of seal it and it'll prevent any rust and it'll maintain your season that you've developed on this. You could tell that's not dirt, that's not dirty, that's seasoned. That's, you know, multiple years of use developing almost a non-stick surface. It's a great thing about cast iron and carbon steel. You get that improves with age characteristic quality of it. Alright, so this guy's ready for the oven. So I'm going to use my meter thermometer probe, stick it in the center, and then place it in the oven. And that's it. That'll tell me when it's at the right temperature.